In the summer of 1991, in a sterile conference room high above the streets of Chicago, a betrayal was about to unfold that would reshape the entire video game industry forever. Two men sat across from each other at a polished mahogany table, the weight of corporate empires resting on their shoulders. One represented Nintendo, the undisputed king of video games, a company that had turned Italian plumbers and pink puffballs into billion-dollar franchises. The other, Sony, a technology giant known for revolutionary Walkmans and crystal-clear televisions, but completely unknown in the brutal, unforgiving world of gaming. What happened in that room would create one of the most bitter rivalries in corporate history, destroy a 5-year partnership built on mutual trust, and accidentally birth the most revolutionary gaming console the world had ever seen, the PlayStation. This is the story of how Sony went from being Nintendo's forgotten partner to their greatest enemy. How a handshake deal forged in good faith became a corporate war that would consume millions of dollars and reshape an entire industry. And how one of the most revolutionary gaming consoles ever made was born not from careful market research or innovative thinking, but from pure, unadulterated revenge. To understand Sony's meteoric rise from electronics manufacturer to gaming overlord, we must first go back to 1988. Ronald Reagan was finishing his presidency. MTV still played music videos, and the world was still recovering from Chernobyl's radioactive legacy. And in the neon-lit streets of Tokyo, two very different companies were about to forge an unlikely alliance that would change everything. Nintendo was riding high on the unprecedented success of the Famicom. Known in America as the Nintendo Entertainment System, they had single-handedly rescued video games from the catastrophic crash of 1983, pulling the entire industry back from the brink of extinction and turning a dead medium into a billion-dollar empire. Mario had become more recognizable than Mickey Mouse. The Legend of Zelda had captivated millions, but Nintendo had a problem, one that threatened to hold back their next generation of consoles: sound. The Famicom's audio was primitive by modern standards, simple beeps and bloops that sounded like electronic hiccups transmitted through a transistor radio. While the graphics were revolutionary for their time, the sound felt stuck in the arcade age of Pac-Man and Space Invaders. Nintendo needed a sophisticated sound chip for their upcoming Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and they knew exactly where to find the expertise. Sony Corporation, the company that had revolutionized portable music with the Walkman, the masters of audio technology. Nintendo approached Sony with a proposition: help us create a new sound chip, and in return, we'll let you into the video game business. The partnership seemed perfect. Nintendo would get superior audio technology. Sony would get their first taste of the lucrative video game market. Both companies signed the deal with confidence, unaware they were planting the seeds of their own epic conflict. But buried deep in the contract's fine print was a clause that would soon terrify Nintendo's executives. Sony wasn't just getting the right to manufacture Nintendo's new system, they were getting the rights to all CD-ROM games that would run on it. Nintendo had just handed their future to their partner. By 1991, 5 years of collaboration had produced something remarkable: the Nintendo PlayStation. Yes, you heard that correctly. Not PlayStation, but Nintendo PlayStation. Words that would soon be seared into gaming history. It was a hybrid console that could play both Nintendo's familiar cartridges and Sony's new Super Disc format, a machine that represented the future of gaming. Only 200 prototypes were ever manufactured, rare machines that would become legendary artifacts of gaming history. Sony's engineers marveled at their creation, running their hands over the sleek gray plastic that felt like the future itself. Here was their entry into the gaming world, a machine that bore both the Nintendo and Sony logos, bridging two technological worlds and representing everything they had dreamed of achieving. But in Nintendo's corporate headquarters in Kyoto, a traditional building where ancient business principles met cutting-edge technology, panic was setting in like a slow poison. They had realized the true magnitude of their mistake. The contract they had signed in good faith 5 years earlier gave Sony unprecedented control over the CD-ROM format, the inevitable future of gaming. If compact discs became the dominant media, replacing expensive cartridges, Sony wouldn't just be Nintendo's partner, they would become their master, controlling the very foundation of the industry. Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was not a man who accepted being outmaneuvered. He had built Nintendo into a gaming empire through cunning and ruthless business tactics. He would not let Sony take his throne. So he decided to do something that would shock the entire industry. The Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, June 1991, the biggest trade show in America, where companies revealed their latest innovations to the world. Sony had come to CES with pride, ready to unveil their Nintendo PlayStation to thousands of journalists and industry insiders. Ken Kutaragi, Sony's lead engineer on the project, stood before the crowd. This was his moment. The culmination of 5 years of work, the Nintendo PlayStation represented everything Sony could become in the gaming world. The presentation was a success. Gaming magazines praised the hybrid console. Sony's executives celebrated. They had finally entered the video game business, and they had done it with Nintendo's blessing. But across town, in another conference room, Nintendo was preparing to deliver a devastating blow. The very next day, Nintendo announced their new partnership with Philips. The Dutch electronics giant would now be Nintendo's CD-ROM partner. The Nintendo PlayStation was dead. Sony's 5 years of work had been rendered worthless overnight. In the brutal language of corporate warfare, Nintendo had just stabbed Sony in the back in front of the entire world. But Nintendo had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed Sony would simply walk away, lick their wounds, and return to making Walkmans and televisions. They were wrong. In Sony's Tokyo headquarters, the mood was funereal. Executives who had dreamed of entering the gaming market watched their ambitions crumble. Some argued for retreat. Video games weren't Sony's business anyway. Why not focus on what they did best? But in a small office overlooking the city, Ken Kutaragi was not ready to give up. The engineer who had dreamed of creating gaming hardware felt the sting of Nintendo's betrayal like a physical wound. He had been humiliated in front of the entire industry. Kutaragi began working on a proposal that would seem insane to most corporate executives. Instead of retreating from gaming, Sony should do the unthinkable. They should declare war on Nintendo. The meeting that would decide Sony's future took place on a gray morning in 1991. Around a polished conference table sat Sony's most senior executives. At the head of the table, Norio Oga, Sony's president, listened as Kutaragi made his pitch. "We shouldn't just make a CD-ROM add-on," Kutaragi argued. "We should create our own gaming console. We should compete directly with Nintendo." The proposal was audacious beyond belief. Nintendo controlled 95% of the Japanese gaming market. They had crushed every competitor who dared challenge them. Atari, once the king of video games, had been reduced to irrelevance. Sega was barely hanging on. What made Sony think they could succeed where others had failed? But Norio Oga saw something his executives missed. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about honor. Nintendo had embarrassed Sony in front of the world. In Japanese corporate culture, such an insult demanded a response. With a stroke of his pen, Oga approved the project that would become the PlayStation. Sony was going to war. What followed was one of the most intense and secretive development cycles in gaming history. Sony assembled a team of engineers unlike any the gaming industry had ever seen. Brilliant minds who had designed everything from compact disc players to professional audio equipment. These weren't video game veterans trapped in the industry's conventions. They were outsiders, bringing fresh perspectives and revolutionary ideas to a medium that had barely begun to explore its potential. While Nintendo still relied on expensive cartridges, a technology that limited game size and drove up costs, Sony committed fully to CD technology with religious obsession. While Nintendo focused on colorful, family-friendly games starring cartoon mascots, Sony aimed for something radically different: sophisticated, mature entertainment designed for teenagers and adults who had grown up with video games and wanted experiences that matched their evolved tastes. But Sony's most revolutionary decision wasn't technical. It was philosophical. They would do something Nintendo had never done, something that would fundamentally alter the power dynamics of the entire industry. Treat game developers as creative partners, not indentured servants. For decades, Nintendo had ruled their developers with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. Strict licensing fees that could bankrupt smaller studios, limited production runs that left popular games artificially scarce, heavy censorship of content that removed blood, violence, and mature themes. Nintendo controlled every aspect of game creation with the absolute authority of a medieval king, and developers had no choice but to accept these draconian terms because Nintendo was the only game in town. Sony offered something revolutionary: respect, lower licensing fees, no censorship, larger production runs. For game developers who had suffered under Nintendo's authoritarian rule, Sony's offer sounded like liberation. By 1994, Sony had assembled not just a console, but an ecosystem. The PlayStation would launch with support from dozens of developers, each eager to create games impossible under Nintendo's restrictive regime. The weapon was ready. Now came the moment of truth. December 3rd, 1994, Tokyo's electronics stores were packed with curious customers and gaming journalists. Sony was about to launch the PlayStation in Japan, directly challenging Nintendo on their home turf. The early signs were promising. Ridge Racer, Sony's showcase racing game, featured graphics that made Nintendo's offerings look primitive by comparison. The CD-quality audio was revolutionary, full orchestral soundtracks instead of electronic beeps. But the real test would come 9 months later, when Sony dared to launch the PlayStation in America, the world's largest gaming market, and Nintendo's stronghold. May 1995, the Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles. Sony faced their greatest challenge yet. Sega had just launched their Saturn console and was announcing its American price. This wasn't just a product launch, it was a direct confrontation between old and new, tradition and revolution. Sega spoke first. They announced the Saturn would cost $399. The audience applauded politely. Then Steve Race, Sony's president of SCEA, took the stage. He said just 3 words, $299, then walked off the stage. Sony had undercut Sega's price by $100 at the last minute. But more than that, they made a statement. Sony wasn't just entering the gaming market, they were here to win. What happened next defied every expert prediction. The PlayStation didn't just compete with Nintendo, it began to dominate them. Within 2 years, the PlayStation had sold over 20 million units worldwide. Games like Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and Gran Turismo showcased experiences impossible on Nintendo's cartridge-based systems. But Sony's victory wasn't just about superior hardware. They had fundamentally changed what video games could be. Gone were the simple platformers and puzzle games that had dominated the Nintendo era. In their place came cinematic adventures, complex narratives, and mature themes. The PlayStation attracted an entirely new audience to gaming. Adults who had dismissed video games as children's toys found themselves captivated by experiences as sophisticated as movies or novels. By 1998, something unthinkable had happened. Sony controlled 47% of the global gaming market. Nintendo, who had once commanded 95%, had fallen to just 28%. The student had become the master. In Nintendo's headquarters in Kyoto, the mood was somber. The company that had ruled video games for over a decade watched helplessly as their empire crumbled. Their betrayal of Sony in 1991 had seemed like a clever business move at the time. Now it looked like the worst decision in gaming history. Meanwhile, in Sony's Tokyo offices, the atmosphere was electric. The company that had been humiliated at CES had achieved something no one thought possible. They had dethroned Nintendo. Ken Kutaragi, the engineer whose dreams had been crushed in Chicago, now found himself leading the most successful gaming platform in the world. The PlayStation had validated his vision and transformed Sony from an electronics company into an entertainment empire. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Sony's triumph was how completely they had redefined the gaming industry. Before the PlayStation, video games were largely seen as toys for children. Sony had proven they could be sophisticated entertainment for adults. Racing games with photorealistic graphics, role-playing games with Hollywood-quality cinematics, horror games that genuinely terrified players. The PlayStation had expanded the very definition of what a video game could be. Today, over 25 years later, the gaming industry looks nothing like it did in 1991. Sony's PlayStation brand has sold over 500 million consoles worldwide. They've released 5 generations of PlayStation hardware, each pushing the boundaries of interactive entertainment. Nintendo, for their part, survived Sony's assault and found new success by focusing on innovation rather than raw power. But they never again achieved the total market dominance they once enjoyed. The betrayal at CES 1991 had consequences neither company could have imagined. Nintendo's attempt to maintain control had created their greatest rival. Sony's humiliation had motivated them to revolutionize an entire industry. But perhaps the most important legacy of the PlayStation revolution isn't corporate rivalry or market share statistics. It's the recognition that video games could be art, not just entertainment. That interactive media could tell stories as powerful as any film or novel. Today's gaming industry, worth over $180 billion annually and reaching billions of players worldwide, exists because one company refused to accept humiliation quietly. In a vault deep within Sony's headquarters sits one of the 200 Nintendo PlayStation prototypes, the machine that started it all. It's a reminder of what might have been and what ultimately was. Nintendo and Sony could have ruled the gaming world together. Instead, their partnership's destruction created something far more valuable: competition that drove both companies to achieve greatness they could never have reached alone. The PlayStation revolution began with betrayal in a Chicago conference room, but it ended with something far more important: the transformation of video games from a niche hobby into the world's most powerful form of interactive entertainment. And it all started with a handshake and a betrayal.